Her grace of manner was as irresistible as her voice, for as Plutarch remarks, there seems to have been this peculiar, undefined charm in her behavior. It may have been largely due to a kind of elusiveness and subtlety, but it would seem also to have been accentuated by a somewhat naive and childish manner, a waywardness, an audacity, a capriciousness which enchanted those around her. Though often wild and inclined to romp, she possessed considerable dignity and at times was haughty and proud. Pliny speaks of her as being disdainful and vain, and indeed so Cicero found her when he met her in Rome. But this was an attitude perhaps assumed by the queen as a defense against the light criticism of those Roman nobles of the Pompeian faction who may have found her position not so honorable as she herself believed it to be. There is indeed little to indicate that her manner was by nature overbearing, and one is inclined to picture her as a natural, impulsive woman who passed readily from haughtiness to simplicity. Her actions were spontaneous, and one may suppose her to have been in her early years as often artless as cunning. Her character was always useful, her temperament vivacious, and her manner frequently what may be called harum scarum. She enjoyed life, and with candor took from it whatever pleasures it held out to her. Her untutored heart leapt from mirth to sorrow, from comedy to tragedy, with unexpected ease, and with her small hands she tossed about her the fabric of her complex circumstances, like a mantle of light and darkness. She was a gifted woman, endowed by nature with ready words and happy wit. She could easily turn her tongue, says Plutarch, like a many-stringed instrument, to any language that she pleased. She had very seldom need of an interpreter for her communication with foreigners, but she answered most men by herself, namely Ethiopians, Troglodytes, Hebrews, Arabs, Syrians, Medes, and Parthians. She is said to have learned the language of many other peoples, though the kings, her predecessors, had not even taken the pains to learn the Egyptian tongue, and some of them had not so much as given up the Macedonian dialect. Statecraft made a strong appeal to her, and as Queen of Egypt, she served the cause of her dynasty's independence and aggrandizement with passionate energy. Dion Cassius tells us that she was intensely ambitious and most careful that due honor should be paid to her throne. Her actions go to confirm this estimate, and one may see her consumed at times with a desire for world power. Though clever and bold, she was not highly skilled, so far as one can see in the diplomatic art. But she seems to have plotted and schemed in the manner common to her house, not so much with great acuteness or profound depths, as with sustained intensity and a sort of conviction. Tenacity of purpose is seen to have been her prevailing characteristic, and her unwavering struggle for her rights and those of her son Caesarion will surely be followed by the interested reader through the long story before him with real admiration. It is unanimously supposed that Cleopatra was, as Josephus words it, a slave to her lusts. The vicious sensuality of the East, the voluptuous degeneracy of an Oriental court, are thought to have found their most apparent expression in the person of this unfortunate queen. Yet what was there, beyond the ignorant and prejudiced talk of her Roman enemies, to give a foundation to such an estimate of her character? She lived practically as Caesar's wife for some years, it being said, I believe with absolute truth, that he intended to make her the Empress of Rome and his legal consort. After his assassination, she married Antony and cohabited with him until the last days of her life. At an age when the legal rights of marriage were violated on every side, when all Rome and all Alexandria were deeply involved in domestic intrigues, Cleopatra, so far as I can see, confined her attentions to the two men who in sequence each acted towards her in the manner of a legitimate husband, each being recognized in Egypt as her divinely sanctioned consort. The words of Dion Cassius, which tells us that no wells could satisfy her and her passions were insatiable, do not suggest a more significant foundation than that her life was lived on extravagant and prodigal lines. There is no doubt that she was open to the accusations of her enemies, who described her habits as dissipated and intemperate, but there seems to be little to indicate that she was in any way a Delilah or a Jezebel. For all we know, she may have been a very moral woman. Certainly she was the fond mother of 4 children, a fact which, even at that day, may be said to indicate to a certain extent a voluntary assumption of the duties of motherhood. After due consideration of all the evidence, I am of opinion that though her nature may have been somewhat voluptuous, and though her passions were not always under control, the best instincts of her sex were by no means absent, and indeed, in her maternal aspect, she may be described as a really good woman. The state of society at the time must be remembered. In Rome, as well as in Alexandria, love intrigues were continuously in progress. Mommsen, in writing of the moral corruption of the age, speaks of the extraordinary degeneracy of the dancing girl of the period, whose record pollutes even the pages of history. But, he adds, there, as it were, licensed trade was materially injured by the free act of the ladies of aristocratic circles. Liaisons in the first houses had become so frequent that only a scandal altogether exceptional could make them the subject of special talk, and judicial interference seemed now almost ridiculous. Against such a background, Cleopatra's domestic life with Caesar and afterwards with Antony assumes by contrast a fair character which is not without its refreshing aspect. We see her intense and lifelong devotion to her eldest son Caesarion. We picture her busy nursery in the royal palace, which at one time resounded to the cries of a pair of lusty twins, and the vision of the oriental voluptuary fades from our eyes. Can this dainty little woman, we ask, who soothes at her breast the cries of her fat baby, while 3 sturdy youngsters play around her, be the sensuous queen of the East? Can this tender, ingenious, smiling mother of Caesar's beloved son be the siren of Egypt? There is not a particle of trustworthy evidence to show that Cleopatra carried on a single love affair in her life, other than the 2 recorded so dramatically by history, nor is there any evidence to show that in those 2 affairs she conducted herself in a licentious manner. Cleopatra was in many ways a refined and cultured woman. Her linguistic powers indicate a certain studiousness, and at the same time she seems to have been a patron of the arts. It is recorded that she made Antony present to the city of Alexandria the library, which once belonged to Pergamum, consisting of 200,000 volumes, and Cicero seems to record the fact that she interested herself in obtaining certain books for him from Alexandria. She inherited from her family a temperament naturally artistic, and there is no reason to suppose that she failed to carry on the high tradition of her house in this regard. She was a patron also of the sciences, and Photinus, the mathematician, who wrote both on arithmetic and geometry, published a book actually under her name, called The Canon of Cleopatra. The famous physician Dioscorides was, it would seem, the friend and the attendant of the queen, and the books which he wrote at her court have been read throughout the ages. Sosigenes, the astronomer, was also perhaps a friend of Cleopatra, and it may have been through her good offices that he was introduced to Caesar, with whom he collaborated in the reformation of the calendar. The evidence is very inconsiderable in regard to the queen's personal attitude towards the arts and sciences, but sufficient may be gleaned to give some support to the suggestion that she did not fall below the standards set by her forefathers. One feels that her interest in such matters is assured by the fact that she held for so long the devotion of such a man of letters as Julius Caesar. There is little doubt that she was capable of showing great seriousness of mind when occasion demanded, and that her demeanor, so frequently tumultuous, was often thoughtful and quiet. At the same time, however, one must suppose that she viewed her life with a light heart, having, save towards the ends, a greater familiarity with laughter than with tears. She was at all times ready to make merry or jest, and a humorous adventure seems to have made a special appeal to her. With Antony, as we shall see, she was wont to wander around the city at night time, knocking at people's doors in the darkness and running away when they were opened. It is related how once, when Antony was fishing in the sea, she made a diver descend into the water to attach to his line a salted fish, which he drew to the surface amidst the greatest merriment. One gathers from the early writers that her conversation was usually sparkling and gay, and it would seem that there was often an infectious frivolity in her manner which made her society most exhilarating. She was eminently a woman whom men might love, for she was active, high-spirited, plucky, and dashing. To use a popular phrase, she was always game for an adventure. Her courageous return to Egypt after she had been driven into exile by her brother is an indication of her brave spirit, and the daring manner in which she first obtained her introduction to Caesar, causing herself to be carried into the palace on a man's back, is a convincing instance of that audacious courage which makes so strong an appeal on her behalf to the imagination. Florus, who was no friend of the queen's, speaks of her as being free from all womanly fear. We now come to the question as to whether she was cruel by nature. It must be admitted that she caused the assassination of her sister Arsinoe and ordered the execution of others who were at that time plotting against her. But it must be remembered that political murders of this kind were a custom, nay, a habit of the period. And moreover, the fact that the Queen of Egypt used her rough soldiers for the purpose does not differentiate the act from that of good Queen Bess, who employed a Lord Chief Justice and an axe. The early demise of Ptolemy XV, her brother, is attributable as much to Caesar as to Cleopatra, if indeed he did not die a natural death. The execution of King Artavasdes of Armenia was a political act of no great significance, and the single remaining charge of cruelty which may be brought against the queen, namely that she tested the efficacy of various poisons on the persons of condemned criminals, need not be regarded as indicating callousness on her part. For it mattered little to the condemned prisoner what manner of sudden death he should die, but, on the other hand, the discovery of pleasant solution to the quandary of her own life was a point of capital importance to herself. When we recall the painful record of callous murders which were perpetrated during the reigns of her predecessors, we cannot attribute to Cleopatra any extraordinary degree of heartlessness, nor can we say that she showed herself to be as cruel as were other members of her family. She lived in a ruthless age, and on the whole, her behavior was tolerant and good-natured. In religious matters she was not, like so many persons of that period, a disbeliever in the power of the gods. She had a strong pagan belief in the close association of divinity and royalty, and she seems to have accepted without question the hereditary assurance of her own celestial affiliation. She was wont to dress herself on gala occasions in the robes of Isis and Aphrodite, and to act the part of a goddess incarnate upon earth, assuming not divine powers, but divine rights. She regarded herself as being closely in communion with the virile gods of Egypt and Greece, and when signs and wonders were pointed out to her by her astrologers, or when she noted good or ill omens in the occurrences around her, she was particularly prone to giving them full recognition as being communications from her heavenly kin. Her behavior at the Battle of Actium is often said to have been due to her consciousness of the warnings which she had received by means of such portents, and on other occasions in her life her actions were ordered by this means. It is related by Josephus that she violated the temples of Egypt in order to obtain money to carry on the war against Rome, and that no place was so holy or so infamous that she would not attempt to strip it of its treasures when she was pressed for gold. If this to be true, it may be argued in the queen's defense that the possessions of the gods were considered by her to be, as it were, her own property, as the representative of heaven upon earth, and in this case they were the more especially at her disposal, since they were to be converted into money for the glory of Egypt. As a matter of fact, it is probable that in the last emergencies of her reign, the queen's agent obtained supplies wherever they found them, and if Cleopatra was consulted at all, she was far too distracted to give the matter very serious thought. It is not necessary here to inquire further into the character of the queen. Her personality, as I see it, will become apparent in the following record of her tragic life. It is essential to remember that though her faults were many, she was not what is usually called bad. She was a brilliant, charming, and beautiful woman, perhaps not over-scrupulous and yet not altogether unprincipled, ready no doubt to make use of her charms, but not in a moral character. As the historian pictures her figure moving lightly through the mazes of her life, now surrounded by her armies in the thick of battle, now sailing up the moonlit Nile in her royal barge with Caesar beside her, now tenderly playing in the nursery with her babies, now presiding brilliantly at the gorgeous feasts in the Alexandrian palace, now racing in disguise down the side streets of her capital, choking with suppressed laughter, now speeding across the Mediterranean of her doom, and now all haggard and forlorn, holding the deadly asp of her body, he cannot fail to fall himself under the spell of that enchantment by which the face of the world was changed. He finds that he is dealing not with the daughter of Satan, who from her lair in the east stretches out her hand to entrap Rome's heroes, but with mighty Caesar's wife and widow, fighting for Caesar's child, with Antony's faithful consort, striving, as will be shown, to unite Egypt and Rome in one vast empire. He sees her not as a crowned courtesan of the Orient, but as the excellent royal lady, who by her wits and graces held captive the two greatest men of her time in the bonds of a union which in Egypt was equivalent to a legal marriage. He sees before him once more the small, graceful figure whose beauty compels, whose voice entices, and in whose face there is no apparent evil, and the unprejudiced historian must find himself hard put to it to say whether his sympathies are ranged on the side of Cleopatra or on that of her Roman rival in the great struggle for the mastery of the whole earth, which is recorded in the following pages.